Sometimes the most dangerous secret in a billionaire's life is the one standing quietly beside him at the altar. The skyline of Manhattan glowed like polished steel under the late afternoon sun, each tower catching the light, as if the city itself had dressed for the occasion. And inside the grand ballroom of the Astoria Regent Hotel, the most powerful names in American finance had gathered beneath chandeliers the size of small cars, their soft golden light reflecting off crystal glasses and marble floors, while cameras from every major business network waited along the velvet-lined aisles. Because tonight wasn't just a wedding, it was a merger wrapped in white silk and champagne. The union of two strategic empires that could reshape entire markets by Monday morning. And at the center of it all stood Nathaniel Carter, 6'2", broad-shouldered, composed with the quiet authority of a man whose signature could move billions of dollars across continents before most people finished their morning coffee. The founder and CEO of Carter Dynamics, a technology and infrastructure powerhouse, headquartered 40 stories above Fifth Avenue. A company that built smart logistics systems used by ports, airports, and rail hubs across North America. A man whose face appeared regularly on magazine covers beside words like visionary, disruptor, and empire builder. And tonight, he was getting married. Nathaniel adjusted the cuff of his charcoal suit with the same calm precision he used when closing acquisitions, his expression controlled, almost distant, as if the orchestra's soft string music and the low murmur of hundreds of guests were simply background noise in a negotiation already settled weeks ago in boardrooms and legal offices, rather than a moment people would call the most romantic day of their lives. Because this marriage had never been about romance. Not for him, not for the investors quietly watching from their tables, and certainly not for the reporters who knew the real headline behind the celebration. Carter Dynamics had just secured a partnership with Holloway Global Shipping, one of the largest logistics networks in the world, and the marriage standing at the center of the ballroom was the final signature on that deal. Cameras tilted forward as the music shifted, and the tall double doors at the end of the aisle slowly opened, revealing the bride for the first time, and a hush spread across the room like a ripple through water. As Amara Brooks stepped into the light, her ivory gown simple compared to the extravagant decorations surrounding her, its lines clean and elegant rather than dramatic, the fabric catching the chandelier glow with a quiet softness that seemed almost deliberate in its restraint, and she moved forward at a measured pace, her posture straight, her gaze calm, her presence composed in a way that didn't match the restless curiosity spreading through the crowd, because while everyone in that room knew Nathaniel Carter, almost no one knew anything about the woman now walking toward him, and in Manhattan's tight circles of wealth and influence, that kind of mystery was rare enough to make people lean closer and whisper. Nathaniel watched her approach with a steady expression, though a small crease formed briefly at the corner of his brow, as if he were examining a detail in a contract that didn't quite match the expected numbers. Because even after weeks of preparation, Amara Brooks remained an unknown variable in an otherwise carefully engineered arrangement, and in his world, unknown variables had a way of becoming risks. Yet she showed no signs of nervousness as she moved down the aisle, no hesitation in her steps, no attempt to perform for the cameras that tracked her every movement, only a quiet confidence that seemed almost immune to the spectacle surrounding her. And for a moment Nathaniel wondered how someone could stand in the center of so much attention and still look as if none of it mattered. At the front row, several executives exchanged subtle glances, their polished shoes crossing and uncrossing beneath the tables as whispers moved between them like currency, questions forming in low voices about the bride's background, her family, her history, because despite the enormous influence of the Carter name, the woman now marrying into it had appeared only weeks ago with almost no public record, a fact that fascinated the press and unsettled more than a few members of Nathaniel's board. But the official explanation had been simple and convenient. Amara Brooks represented a private investment group connected to Holloway Global, and this marriage was part of a broader strategic alignment between companies preparing for the next generation of infrastructure development across North America. And if anyone suspected there might be more to the story, they had not said it out loud. Amara reached the front of the aisle and met Nathaniel's gaze for the first time since the ceremony began, her eyes steady, dark and thoughtful, carrying a quiet depth that made it difficult to read exactly what she was thinking. and when she placed her hand in his, her fingers were warm but firm, not trembling the way many brides might in a room filled with cameras and industry titans. And Nathaniel felt a brief flicker of something unfamiliar. Not emotion exactly, but curiosity. The same quiet alertness he experienced when a competitor made a move he hadn't predicted. The officiant spoke in a measured voice about partnership and commitment while the orchestra softened behind him. But the words floated above the room like formal decorations rather than truths anyone truly expected to define this union. Because those who understood Nathaniel Carter knew that every relationship in his life operated according to rules, agreements, and clearly defined boundaries. And this marriage was no exception. A contract dressed in ceremony, a strategic alliance designed to strengthen the position of his company in an increasingly competitive global market. Yet as the vows continued and the cameras recorded every moment, there was something about Amara's composure that quietly unsettled the carefully controlled atmosphere of the room. Because while Nathaniel stood exactly as expected, confident, disciplined, every movement aligned with the image of a billionaire CEO who had built an empire before the age of 40. The woman beside him seemed untouched by the performance unfolding around them, her expression calm, her posture dignified, as if she were standing inside a moment far more significant than a corporate arrangement disguised as a wedding. When the officiant asked them to exchange rings, Nathaniel slid the diamond band onto her finger with the same steady hands that had signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and Amara returned the gesture without hesitation, her voice clear, and even as she repeated the formal words that sealed their union. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom a camera shutter clicked rapidly, capturing the image that would appear across financial news websites within the hour. Nathaniel Carter, America's most disciplined billionaire strategist, marrying a woman almost no one in the room truly knew. But what none of the guests could see, what none of the cameras could capture, was the quiet thought passing through Amara Brooks's mind as she stood beside the most powerful man in the room. Because while everyone believed this marriage had been arranged to secure a business empire, the truth was far more complicated than any headline could explain, and the life Nathaniel Carter thought he was merging with tonight carried a secret capable of changing far more than his company's future. The applause inside the Astoria Regent Ballroom rolled across the marble floor like distant thunder, polite and controlled rather than emotional. The kind of applause reserved for a successful transaction rather than a love story. And as Nathaniel Carter and Amara Brooks turned toward the guests after the ceremony, cameras flashed in steady bursts that reflected off the crystal chandeliers above them, capturing the image that every business network had been waiting for all afternoon. The billionaire strategist and his mysterious new wife standing side by side beneath a ceiling painted with gold leaf and soft blue clouds that looked almost unreal in the artificial light. And to most people in that room the moment meant one thing only: confirmation that a major corporate alliance had just been sealed in the most public way possible. Nathaniel offered the small, controlled smile he had perfected over years of interviews and investor conferences, the same expression that communicated confidence without revealing anything personal, while the orchestra shifted into a light celebratory melody and servers in crisp white jackets began circulating with silver trays of champagne flutes. The delicate sound of glass touching glass blending with the low hum of conversation as the room gradually relaxed after the formal vows. Yet, Nathaniel's attention remained focused on the woman standing beside him, because although the ceremony had ended exactly as planned, Amara Brooks still remained the one element of the evening that could not be measured in spreadsheets or legal agreements. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server with a polite nod, but did not drink, her gaze moving slowly across the ballroom as if studying the room rather than celebrating within it. And Nathaniel noticed how naturally she carried herself despite the fact that she had just entered one of the most powerful social circles in New York, a world where reputations were built over decades and strangers were usually examined with careful suspicion. Yet Amara showed no sign of trying to impress anyone, no eager smile toward the cameras, no nervous attempt to blend into the crowd, only the same calm composure she had carried down the aisle. Several guests approached almost immediately, executives and investors eager to congratulate Nathaniel, while quietly observing the woman who had suddenly become part of his public life. and their voices carried the subtle curiosity of people who had spent their entire careers reading situations carefully before making a move. One older board member from Carter Dynamics leaned slightly toward Nathaniel and spoke in a voice just low enough to remain private while still smiling politely toward Amara. "You certainly kept this one quiet, Nathaniel. The press will be chasing details for weeks." Nathaniel gave a short nod that could be interpreted as agreement without offering any real information. Privacy is sometimes the most valuable asset in a negotiation. The man chuckled softly, accepting the answer without pressing further, but his eyes lingered on Amara for a moment longer before he moved away into the crowd, and Nathaniel could already feel the ripple of speculation spreading through the ballroom, because in a city that thrived on information, a secret was always more interesting than a story that had been fully explained. Amara set her untouched champagne glass on a nearby table and looked toward the tall windows that lined the far wall of the ballroom, where the evening sky over Manhattan had begun to turn deep blue as the sun slipped behind the skyline, and the reflection of the city lights shimmered across the glass like distant stars. Nathaniel followed her gaze briefly before speaking for the first time since the ceremony ended. "You handled that better than most people would." His voice was calm, almost analytical, as if he were evaluating the outcome of a meeting rather than complimenting his new wife. Amara turned slightly toward him, her expression thoughtful but steady. It was not difficult. People expected to see confidence, so that is what they saw. Nathaniel studied her for a moment, recognizing the quiet intelligence behind the simplicity of her words. In his experience, many people who entered rooms like this tried too hard to prove they belonged there, but Amara had done the opposite, and the result was strangely effective. A group of reporters had begun gathering near the far side of the ballroom, their cameras angled toward the newly married couple in anticipation of a brief public appearance, and Nathaniel could already hear the distant murmur of producers preparing their questions, each one hoping to uncover some detail that would turn tonight's business announcement into a more human story for their viewers. He glanced toward the small corridor leading away from the ballroom, then back at Amara. "There will be interviews in about 10 minutes. Nothing complicated. They will ask the usual questions about partnership and the future of the companies." Amara nodded once, absorbing the information without hesitation. "And our answers will be exactly what the agreement states." Nathaniel allowed a faint hint of approval to appear in his expression because it was clear she understood the structure of the arrangement perfectly. Their marriage had been negotiated with the same precision as any major corporate deal, including public messaging, press statements, and carefully prepared answers designed to reinforce the narrative that tonight's wedding represented a powerful strategic alliance rather than a personal story. The only element that had not been fully explained to him was the woman herself. As they began walking slowly through the crowd toward the corridor, guests stepped aside respectfully, offering congratulations while quietly observing the dynamic between them, and Nathaniel noticed that Amara acknowledged each person with a polite smile, but never lingered long enough to encourage conversation, moving through the room with a calm efficiency that suggested she had already decided how much of herself she intended to reveal to this world. When they reached the corridor, the noise of the ballroom softened behind them, replaced by the quieter atmosphere of a marble hallway lit by warm wall lamps that cast gentle shadows along the polished floor. For the first time since the ceremony began, the two of them were briefly alone. Nathaniel stopped near a tall window overlooking Park Avenue, the evening traffic moving steadily below like a river of headlights stretching into the distance. "There are rules we should review now that the public part is finished," he said evenly. Amara folded her hands lightly in front of her, listening without interruption. "This marriage exists to support the partnership between Carter Dynamics and Holloway Global. Our personal lives will remain separate. There will be no interference with my business decisions, and I expect the same level of discretion from you." Amara met his gaze without hesitation, her voice calm and steady when she responded. That was always the understanding. Nathaniel nodded once, satisfied with the clarity of her answer, yet something in her tone made him pause because it carried a quiet confidence that did not quite match the image many people in the ballroom had assumed about her. Most people entering his world showed at least a hint of uncertainty when faced with its expectations, but Amara Brooks stood there as if she had already measured the weight of that world and decided it would not intimidate her. From the ballroom entrance, the distant sound of reporters preparing their cameras reached them again, a reminder that the evening was far from over, and Nathaniel straightened his jacket slightly before turning back toward the doorway. In a few minutes, the headlines will start spreading across every business network in the country, he said. The city will believe this marriage was arranged to secure an empire. Amara's eyes moved briefly toward the glowing skyline beyond the window, the reflection of the city lights dancing softly across the glass. Then she looked back at him with the same composed expression she had worn all evening. That is exactly what they should believe. Nathaniel studied her for a brief moment longer, sensing again that there were layers to her story that had not yet been revealed. But the corridor lights flickered slightly as a production assistant approached to signal that the press conference was ready to begin, and the moment passed as both of them turned toward the ballroom doors, stepping back into the glow of cameras and expectation while the city outside continued moving forward, unaware that the quiet woman now standing beside one of the most powerful men in Manhattan carried a past that would soon make this carefully arranged marriage far more complicated than anyone in that ballroom could possibly imagine. The corridor doors opened again, and the noise of the ballroom rushed back toward them like a wave of light and sound, cameras already turning in their direction as soon as Nathaniel Carter and Amara Brooks stepped through the archway, because the press had been waiting for this exact moment since the first invitation had circulated through Manhattan's business circles 3 weeks earlier. And now the most powerful executives in the room quietly moved aside while a cluster of reporters gathered. Near the small stage set beneath a banner displaying the combined logos of Carter Dynamics and Holloway Global Shipping, the polished metal letters reflecting the chandelier light like the title of a corporate announcement rather than the symbol of a marriage. Nathaniel guided Amara forward with calm efficiency, the same steady pace he used when walking into an investor briefing. And although dozens of eyes followed them, his expression remained composed and controlled, while Amara walked beside him with the same quiet confidence she had carried throughout the evening, her posture straight, her gaze focused, her presence steady enough that even the reporters seemed to hesitate for a moment before raising their microphones. A senior journalist from a major financial network stepped forward first, holding a microphone marked with the blue logo of Global Market News. Mr. Carter, congratulations on the merger and the wedding. Investors are calling this one of the most strategic alliances in the infrastructure sector this year. Can you tell us what this partnership means for the future of Carter Dynamics? Nathaniel gave a brief nod, his voice calm and measured when he spoke. Carter Dynamics has always focused on building systems that connect industries more efficiently. By aligning with Holloway Global Shipping, we are strengthening the infrastructure that moves goods across this country and beyond. This partnership allows us to expand technology that improves ports, rail hubs, and distribution networks nationwide. Another reporter leaned forward slightly, turning her attention toward Amara with a polite but curious smile. Mrs. Carter, many people are interested in learning more about you. Until recently, your name was not widely known in New York business circles. What role will you play in this partnership moving forward? For a brief second, the room grew slightly quieter, because the question everyone had been thinking had finally been asked aloud. Amara looked toward the reporters with calm composure, her voice steady and thoughtful as she answered. My focus has always been on building systems that help communities grow stronger. Partnerships like this create opportunities for innovation that reach beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. I intend to support that vision wherever it leads. Her answer was clear but intentionally broad, revealing nothing personal while still sounding sincere enough to satisfy the moment. And Nathaniel noticed several reporters exchange quick glances as they wrote notes or adjusted their cameras, realizing that the woman beside him understood exactly how public conversations worked. The questions continued for several minutes, each one circling the same themes of business growth, economic strategy, and the future of infrastructure development across North America, and both Nathaniel and Amara responded with the calm professionalism expected from leaders whose decisions could influence entire industries. Eventually, the press coordinator stepped forward to signal that the brief interview session had ended, and the reporters lowered their microphones while the newly married couple stepped down from the small stage, returning once again to the wider ballroom, where music and conversation continued flowing around them. The celebration gradually shifted from formal ceremony to social gathering as executives began discussing projects and investments at nearby tables, the low murmur of business conversations blending with the distant rhythm of a jazz trio, now playing softly near the far wall. Nathaniel moved through the room, exchanging brief words with key partners, but several times he noticed that Amara had quietly stepped away from the clusters of guests, choosing instead to stand near the tall windows overlooking the city skyline. She did not appear uncomfortable or withdrawn, only observant, as if studying the environment with thoughtful patience. Nearly half an hour later, when the main reception began winding down and many guests had already departed for evening meetings or private dinners, Nathaniel finally approached her again near the windows where the lights of midtown Manhattan stretched across the horizon like a field of glowing stars. The city looked different from this height, the steady movement of traffic far below appearing almost peaceful from 40 floors above the street. "You handled the press well," Nathaniel said quietly. Amara gave a small nod, her eyes still on the skyline. They asked the questions they were supposed to ask. Nathaniel studied her profile for a moment, noticing again how naturally calm she seemed despite the attention she had received all evening. Most people in that position would have tried harder to impress them. Amara turned slightly toward him, her expression thoughtful. Attention fades quickly in this city. What matters is what remains after the cameras leave. Nathaniel considered her words carefully, recognizing the truth behind them. Manhattan had a way of celebrating headlines for exactly one day before moving on to the next story, yet something about Amara's tone suggested that she was thinking about consequences beyond media attention. He folded his arms loosely as he looked out over the skyline again. Tomorrow morning the business channels will analyze tonight for hours. Analysts will speculate about what this alliance means for supply chains, technology investments, and national infrastructure projects. They will assume everything is exactly what it appears to be. Amara allowed a faint smile to appear, subtle but unmistakable. That assumption is useful. Nathaniel glanced toward her again, sensing the deeper meaning behind the simplicity of her response. And for a moment, he almost asked the question that had been quietly forming in his mind since the ceremony began, the question about who she truly was beyond the carefully structured agreement that had brought them together. Before he could speak, however, his phone vibrated gently in the inside pocket of his jacket, a discreet signal that someone from his executive team was trying to reach him. He stepped slightly aside to check the message, his eyes scanning the short notification on the screen before returning to Amara. It was from Marcus Hale, his chief operations officer and the one person in the company responsible for monitoring potential risks to major corporate decisions. The message was brief but unusual. "We need to discuss something regarding your wife. Call when available." Nathaniel slipped the phone back into his pocket, maintaining the same calm expression he had carried all evening, but the small alert had sharpened his focus instantly. Marcus Hale did not send vague messages during major corporate events unless something required immediate attention. Across from him Amara remained quietly composed, watching the lights of the city without any sign of concern, and Nathaniel suddenly realized that despite the elaborate planning behind this alliance, there were still parts of her life he had never examined closely. The reception staff began dimming the ballroom lights slightly as the final guests gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, and Nathaniel turned toward the exit, where the private elevators waited to take them down to the street-level entrance. "Our car should be ready downstairs," he said calmly. Amara nodded and followed him toward the corridor once again, her steps measured and steady, while behind them the grand ballroom slowly emptied of executives and reporters who believed they had just witnessed a carefully orchestrated business marriage that would strengthen two powerful companies. Yet as Nathaniel stepped into the elevator beside the quiet woman who had just become part of his life, he could not ignore the small message waiting in his pocket, or the growing sense that the arrangement he believed he fully understood might hold far more complexity than anyone in that ballroom had imagined. The private elevator descended smoothly through the quiet interior of the Astoria Regent Tower, its glass walls reflecting the warm glow of the city lights outside, while Manhattan continued moving with its usual late evening rhythm far below. Taxis flowing through intersections like ribbons of yellow light and office windows glowing in long rows across the skyline. Yet inside the elevator the atmosphere felt noticeably calmer than the crowded ballroom they had just left behind. the noise of celebration replaced by the soft mechanical hum of the descending car. Nathaniel Carter stood with the composed stillness that had defined his presence all evening, one hand resting lightly against the polished steel railing as he watched the numbers above the door change floor by floor, while Amara Brooks stood beside him with the same quiet confidence she had carried since the ceremony, her posture relaxed but attentive as if she were absorbing the moment rather than reacting to it. For several seconds neither of them spoke, the silence not uncomfortable but thoughtful, until Nathaniel finally turned slightly toward her. "The press will continue analyzing tonight for the next few days," he said calmly. "Most of the business channels will frame this marriage as the final move in a strategic expansion." Amara nodded once, her voice steady. "That is the story they are supposed to see." Nathaniel studied her expression briefly, noticing again how deliberately she chose her words, never rushing to explain more than necessary. And he found himself increasingly aware that despite all the background checks conducted during the weeks leading up to the agreement, the woman now standing beside him remained a mystery in ways he was not accustomed to dealing with. The elevator doors opened quietly into the private lobby where a uniformed driver waited near the glass entrance holding a small sign with Carter Dynamics printed in silver letters across the top. And as Nathaniel and Amara stepped outside, the cool night air of Park Avenue greeted them with the distant sound of traffic and the steady pulse of the city that never truly slept. Their black sedan waited at the curb beneath a row of tall street lamps, the polished surface of the car reflecting the skyscrapers that stretched upward into the dark sky, like enormous pillars of steel and glass. The driver opened the rear door with practiced professionalism, and Nathaniel gestured for Amara to enter first, a simple courtesy that felt almost ceremonial after the formalities of the evening. Once inside the car, the quiet interior created a small private world separate from the movement of the city outside, the leather seats soft beneath them, while the windows filtered the noise of Manhattan into a distant hum. The car pulled away from the curb and merged into the late evening traffic, passing rows of restaurants and office towers whose lights continued glowing long after most people would have gone home. Nathaniel looked briefly out the window before reaching into his jacket pocket and retrieving his phone again, the short message from Marcus Hale still waiting on the screen. He hesitated for a moment, weighing the timing of the call, then finally pressed the contact and raised the phone to his ear as the car moved steadily down Park Avenue. Marcus answered almost immediately. "Nathaniel, I was not sure when you would be free." Nathaniel kept his voice calm and controlled. "I have a few minutes now." "Your message sounded unusual." There was a short pause on the other end before Marcus spoke again, his tone careful but direct. "I started reviewing the background reports again after the ceremony. There is something about your wife that does not match the profile we received from Holloway Global." Nathaniel's eyes shifted briefly toward Amara, who sat quietly beside him watching the city lights pass across the window, then back toward the dark glass ahead. "Explain." Marcus exhaled slowly. "Her name appears in connection with an organization called the Brooks Justice Foundation. It is a small nonprofit group based in Harlem. It focuses on legal advocacy and community programs." Nathaniel's expression remained composed, though his attention sharpened instantly. "That does not sound unusual." Marcus continued carefully. "The unusual part is that the foundation was created after a major corporate investigation about 6 years ago. The case involved several large infrastructure companies accused of financial misconduct." Nathaniel leaned slightly forward in his seat, the quiet interior of the car suddenly feeling more focused. "I remember that investigation. It caused significant regulatory changes." "Exactly," Marcus said. "And according to the archived records, the key witness who helped bring the investigation forward had the same name as your wife." Nathaniel's gaze moved slowly toward Amara again, studying her calm reflection in the window while the city lights flickered across the glass like distant stars. "You are saying my wife was involved in exposing a corporate scandal." "That is what the documents suggest," Marcus replied. "However, the details were sealed after the investigation concluded. Public records only mention the foundation she created afterward." Nathaniel ended the call a moment later, thanking Marcus for the information without offering further comment, and slipped the phone back into his pocket as the car continued moving through midtown traffic. For several seconds he remained silent, considering what he had just heard, while the glow of streetlights drifted across the interior of the vehicle in slow intervals. Amara finally turned slightly toward him, her voice calm. That message was about me, was not it? Nathaniel met her gaze, recognizing immediately that there was little value in pretending otherwise. It was about something connected to your past. The Brooks Justice Foundation. Amara watched him quietly for a moment before giving a small nod, neither surprised nor defensive. I wondered how long it would take before someone mentioned it. Nathaniel rested his hands lightly together, his voice measured but curious. My team did not find that information in the initial reports. Amara's eyes moved back toward the passing skyline beyond the window. Some stories do not stay in public records forever. Nathaniel considered her words carefully, remembering Marcus's explanation about sealed documents and corporate investigations. You were involved in exposing a major corruption case, he said slowly. Amara did not immediately respond, but after a moment she spoke again with the same calm tone she had used all evening. I was involved in telling the truth about something powerful people hoped would remain hidden. The car continued traveling through Manhattan, while the city lights reflected across the windows like quiet sparks in the dark, and Nathaniel felt the structure of the arrangement he had so carefully negotiated beginning to shift slightly in his mind, because the woman sitting beside him was no longer simply the mysterious partner introduced through a strategic alliance. She was someone who had once stood at the center of a story capable of shaking entire industries, and suddenly the carefully controlled marriage he believed he understood seemed to carry a deeper significance than anyone had realized when the ceremony began. The black sedan moved steadily through the late evening streets of Manhattan, while the city lights reflected across the windows like quiet constellations drifting past in slow motion, and inside the calm interior of the car the air felt different now, heavier with the weight of a truth that had only just begun to surface. Nathaniel Carter remained seated with his posture composed, his hands resting loosely together while his mind examined the information Marcus Hale had uncovered, because in Nathaniel's world the past was never just a story. It was data, risk, leverage, and consequence. And the idea that the woman sitting beside him had once stood at the center of a corporate investigation involving major infrastructure companies forced him to reconsider every assumption he had made about the arrangement they had entered tonight. Amara Brooks remained quiet for several moments after his last question, her eyes watching the reflections of the city glide across the window, as if she had already accepted that this conversation would eventually arrive. The car passed beneath a row of tall streetlights, and the glow briefly illuminated her expression before fading again into the darker rhythm of the moving city. Finally she spoke, her voice calm and steady. 6 years ago, several companies were involved in a network of contracts that were supposed to fund large transportation upgrades across multiple states. Bridges, ports, rail distribution hubs. Projects that communities had been waiting for decades to see completed. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, his focus sharpening with the quiet intensity he used when reviewing major negotiations. Amara continued slowly. The funding was approved, the announcements were made, and the companies involved promised economic growth and thousands of jobs. But behind the public statements, the numbers told a different story. Contracts were shifted between subsidiaries, funds were redirected through private consulting firms, and some of the infrastructure projects were quietly reduced or delayed without explanation. Nathaniel nodded faintly, recognizing the pattern she described. Corporate restructuring could hide many things when the right legal frameworks were in place. Amara turned slightly toward him now, meeting his gaze with quiet clarity. Most people never noticed because the changes were gradual. A bridge project became a smaller renovation. A rail hub expansion turned into a feasibility study. Money moved in ways that were technically legal but ethically questionable. Nathaniel leaned slightly back in his seat as he processed her explanation. And you noticed? Amara gave a small nod. I worked for one of the legal research teams hired to review the public funding agreements. At first it was routine work, but the deeper we looked, the more inconsistencies appeared. Eventually the evidence suggested that several corporations had coordinated the changes to protect their profits, while the communities waiting for those projects received less than what had been promised. Nathaniel understood immediately why the case had attracted national attention years earlier. Infrastructure contracts involved billions of dollars and multiple layers of government oversight. Exposing irregularities inside that system would have forced powerful companies to answer difficult questions. What happened next? He asked quietly. Amara looked out toward the dark skyline again before answering. The investigation expanded. Federal auditors reviewed the records, regulatory agencies requested documentation, and eventually several companies agreed to settlements that required structural changes to how their contracts were managed. Nathaniel remembered reading the headlines when the story broke, though the details had faded with time as new business stories replaced it in the news cycle. And the Brooks Justice Foundation. Amara's voice softened slightly when she spoke again. After the investigation ended, I wanted to create something that helped communities understand how these systems worked. Many people never realized they had the right to ask questions about public infrastructure funding. The foundation provided legal education and support so neighborhoods could advocate for the projects they were promised. Nathaniel studied her carefully, recognizing that what she described was not the behavior of someone seeking attention or profit. You created the foundation after exposing the investigation. Amara nodded once. I created it because the investigation showed me how easily ordinary people can be ignored when powerful institutions make decisions behind closed doors. The car continued through midtown traffic while the city pulsed quietly outside the windows, and Nathaniel realized that the story she had just told was far more significant than the simple background detail Marcus Hale had uncovered. The woman sitting beside him had not only witnessed a major corporate scandal, she had helped reveal it. And now she had married into another powerful corporate structure, his own. Why did Holloway Global recommend you as part of this partnership? He asked thoughtfully. Amara's expression remained calm but reflective. Because some of the same companies involved in that investigation are still active in the infrastructure industry today. Nathaniel felt the meaning of her words settle slowly into place. You believe those companies are still influencing projects? Amara did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked down at her hands for a moment before speaking again. I believe some stories do not end when the headlines fade. Nathaniel watched her closely, recognizing that beneath her quiet tone there was a deeper layer of concern she had not fully explained. Outside the car, the skyline shifted as they moved farther downtown, the towering buildings giving way to quieter streets lined with historic stone facades and softly glowing storefronts. Finally, Nathaniel spoke again, his voice thoughtful rather than confrontational. When you agreed to marry me as part of this alliance, you already knew my company operates in the same industry as those corporations. Amara met his gaze directly now, her expression calm but sincere. Yes. Nathaniel held her gaze for several seconds, recognizing the deliberate honesty in her answer. And you still agreed to this arrangement? Amara nodded slightly. Because Carter Dynamics is different. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow faintly. That is a strong statement. Amara gave a quiet smile, subtle but genuine. Your company focuses on technological infrastructure and logistics systems. It builds tools that improve efficiency rather than manipulating funding agreements. Nathaniel considered her explanation carefully. You studied my company before agreeing to this marriage. I study everything that affects communities, she replied gently. The car slowed as it approached a quieter residential avenue where Nathaniel's private penthouse building stood among a row of elegant towers overlooking the East River. The driver turned smoothly toward the entrance while the city lights shimmered across the water in the distance. As the vehicle came to a stop beneath the covered entrance, Nathaniel realized that the conversation they had just shared had quietly transformed his understanding of the woman beside him. She was no longer simply the mysterious partner introduced through a strategic alliance, nor merely the founder of a small nonprofit organization. She was someone who had once stepped into a system powerful enough to shape entire industries and chosen to challenge it with quiet determination. And as the driver stepped out to open the door, Nathaniel Carter understood something he had not expected when the evening began. The carefully structured marriage he had arranged might now place him directly beside a woman whose past had already proven capable of changing the course of powerful institutions. The car door opened beneath the quiet glow of the covered entrance, and the cool night air from the East River drifted softly through the street as Nathaniel Carter stepped out onto the polished stone driveway of his residential tower, a building known in Manhattan for housing some of the most private penthouses in the city. The driver moved around the car to assist Amara Brooks, and she stepped out with the same composed grace she had carried throughout the evening, her gaze briefly lifting toward the tall glass facade of the building that rose nearly 60 stories above them, its upper floors reflecting the silver shimmer of the river and the distant lights of Queens across the water. The doorman greeted Nathaniel with a respectful nod and opened the large glass doors that led into the quiet marble lobby, where warm lighting and polished stone created an atmosphere that felt more like a private gallery than a residential building. A long reception desk stood near the far wall, and behind it a concierge quietly acknowledged Nathaniel's arrival while maintaining the discretion expected in a building where privacy was valued above everything else. Nathaniel walked across the lobby with steady confidence, Amara beside him, and the sound of their footsteps echoed gently across the marble floor as they approached the private elevator reserved for the penthouse levels. When the elevator doors opened, the interior revealed a spacious cabin with dark walnut paneling and soft recessed lighting, and Nathaniel pressed the button for the top floor before the doors closed quietly behind them. For a moment, the elevator moved upward in silence, the city disappearing below them as the building carried them higher toward the private residence that had become Nathaniel's home during the years he built Carter Dynamics into one of the most influential infrastructure technology companies in the country. Amara watched the changing numbers above the door with thoughtful calm before speaking quietly. This building must have a remarkable view of the river. Nathaniel gave a small nod. The architects designed the top floors so the windows face both the river and Midtown. You can see nearly the entire city from the terrace. The elevator slowed gently as it reached the final level, and the doors opened directly into the penthouse foyer where soft lighting illuminated a wide hallway lined with modern artwork and tall glass windows overlooking the water. Nathaniel stepped forward first and gestured lightly for Amara to follow, and as they moved deeper into the residence, the scale of the space became clear. The penthouse extended across nearly the entire floor, with high ceilings and wide-open living areas that blended modern architecture with quiet luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched along the eastern wall, revealing the dark surface of the East River below, where reflections of bridges and distant traffic moved slowly across the water like floating ribbons of light. Amara paused near the windows for a moment, taking in the view with quiet appreciation. "It is beautiful," she said softly. Nathaniel watched her reaction with a thoughtful expression. "The city looks different from this height. Everything appears calmer than it really is." Amara gave a faint smile at that observation, understanding the deeper meaning behind it. From a distance, many complicated systems appear simple. Nathaniel walked toward a sleek marble counter near the open kitchen and poured 2 glasses of water before handing one to her. The evening had been long, filled with conversations, cameras, and the constant presence of people analyzing every word spoken between them. Now the quiet of the penthouse created a different atmosphere, one that felt far removed from the public world they had just left behind. Nathaniel leaned lightly against the counter while considering the conversation they had shared during the drive. "Your past investigation," he said after a moment, "must have attracted significant attention at the time." Amara held the glass carefully in both hands, her gaze moving slowly across the city lights beyond the windows. "It did," she replied. "For several months, every major news outlet wanted to understand how the investigation unfolded. The companies involved had strong reputations and powerful legal teams. The idea that internal contracts had been manipulated surprised many people." Nathaniel studied her quietly, and after the settlements were reached, the attention faded. Amara nodded gently. "Most stories eventually fade when new ones appear. But the systems that created the problems do not always change as quickly as the headlines suggest." Nathaniel understood the implication immediately. The companies involved in that investigation were still active in infrastructure development. Some had simply reorganized their corporate structures and continued operating under different subsidiaries. "You believe similar patterns could still exist today?" he said thoughtfully. Amara turned slightly toward him, her expression calm but serious. "I believe transparency only works when people continue asking questions." Nathaniel considered that carefully, recognizing the quiet determination behind her words. For several seconds, he said nothing, simply observing the woman who had entered his life through a carefully negotiated corporate arrangement, yet carried a history that suggested she had already challenged systems far more complex than a business partnership. Finally, he spoke again. When Holloway Global introduced your name during the negotiations, they described you as someone capable of representing long-term community interests in infrastructure planning. They did not mention your involvement in that investigation. Amara met his gaze with composed honesty. Some people believe it is easier to begin new partnerships without reopening old conflicts. Nathaniel understood the strategy. Corporate negotiations often moved more smoothly when difficult histories remained unspoken. Yet now that he knew part of her story, the partnership between their companies seemed less straightforward than it had appeared during the weeks of preparation leading to tonight's ceremony. Outside the windows, the lights of the city stretched across the horizon, while a slow-moving ferry crossed the dark surface of the river below. Nathaniel walked toward the windows and looked out over the water for a moment before turning back toward her. "There is something else I need to understand," he said calmly. Amara waited quietly for him to continue. "If you believe those corporate systems still had unresolved problems, why agree to marry someone whose company operates in the same industry?" Amara considered the question carefully before answering. "Because Carter Dynamics does not rely on those systems in the same way other companies do. Your technology improves efficiency within existing infrastructure. It does not depend on manipulating public funding structures." Nathaniel recognized that she had studied his company's model thoroughly before accepting the alliance. Still, he asked gently, "You must have known this arrangement would place you back inside a world connected to the investigation you once helped reveal." Amara gave a quiet nod. "Yes." Nathaniel watched her closely. "That seems like a significant decision." Amara looked toward the city again before responding, her voice calm but thoughtful. "Sometimes the best way to understand whether systems have truly changed is to observe them from the inside." Nathaniel absorbed her words slowly, realizing that the woman standing inside his penthouse tonight might not only be his partner in a corporate alliance, but also someone who intended to watch closely how the powerful institutions of the infrastructure industry continued to operate. And as the quiet of the penthouse settled around them, Nathaniel Carter began to understand that the marriage he had arranged to strengthen his company might now place him beside someone whose purpose extended far beyond the business strategy that had brought them together. The quiet of the penthouse stretched gently across the room as the city lights shimmered beyond the tall glass windows, and for several minutes neither Nathaniel Carter nor Amara Brooks spoke, the stillness carrying a weight that was not uncomfortable but thoughtful, as if both of them were carefully adjusting their understanding of the unusual partnership that had just begun between them. The distant sound of a ferry horn echoed across the East River, low and steady, while a thin trail of light from the Brooklyn Bridge traced across the water like a silver ribbon moving slowly through the night. Nathaniel finally walked toward the window again, resting one hand lightly against the cool glass as he looked out over the skyline that had shaped much of his life. For years he had viewed the city from offices, boardrooms, and conference stages, always measuring the world through strategy and numbers. Yet tonight the presence of the woman behind him had introduced an unexpected element into that familiar equation. When he spoke again, his voice carried the calm tone he used when approaching a new problem that required careful reasoning. "If your intention was to observe the industry from the inside, this alliance gives you a closer perspective than most investigators ever have." Amara stood near the wide living area, her posture relaxed but attentive as she listened. "That is true," she replied quietly. Nathaniel turned slightly toward her, studying her expression with the same focused attention he applied to business negotiations. "Yet you must have realized that marrying the chief executive of a major infrastructure technology company would also place you under significant public scrutiny." Amara nodded once, acknowledging the obvious reality of his statement. "It did." Nathaniel walked slowly across the room and set his glass of water down on the polished marble counter before continuing. "Then I need to ask you something directly. Did you enter this arrangement only to observe the industry, or is there something specific you are looking for?" Amara remained silent for a moment, considering how to answer. The lights of the city reflected softly across the windows behind Nathaniel, creating long patterns of gold and blue across the polished floor, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same steady honesty that had defined their conversation throughout the evening. "There is something specific," she said. Nathaniel waited without interrupting. Amara continued slowly. The investigation 6 years ago revealed several companies that redirected infrastructure funds through complex networks of subsidiaries and consulting agreements. Many of those companies reached legal settlements, but the structure of their partnerships allowed certain executives to avoid direct responsibility. Nathaniel understood the implication immediately. The companies changed their public behavior without necessarily changing the people who controlled them. Exactly, Amara replied. She walked slowly toward the windows, stopping a few feet away from Nathaniel so that both of them faced the wide view of the river and the city beyond it. Over the past year, the Brooks Justice Foundation has continued monitoring infrastructure development projects across several states. In some cases, the same consulting firms connected to the original investigation have quietly reappeared in new contracts. Nathaniel crossed his arms thoughtfully. That suggests the system may still be operating through different channels. Amara nodded. It suggests the possibility that certain patterns never completely disappeared. Nathaniel remained silent for a few seconds while the significance of her words settled into place. Carter Dynamics did not operate through the funding structure she described, but the infrastructure industry was a complex network where technology firms, construction companies, and financial partners often intersected. If some of those patterns still existed, the consequences could eventually affect everyone connected to the industry. And you believe observing the system from within a corporate alliance will help reveal those patterns, he said calmly. Amara looked toward him again. I believe it allows me to see things that public reports cannot show. Nathaniel studied her expression carefully, recognizing that her motivation was not driven by curiosity alone. There was a quiet determination behind her words, the same determination that had once helped bring a major corporate investigation to light. Yet something about her explanation still felt incomplete. He asked the next question slowly, choosing his words with precision. When you agreed to this marriage, did you expect Carter Dynamics to become part of that investigation? Amara answered without hesitation. No. Nathaniel watched her for a moment longer before nodding slightly. I appreciate your honesty. Amara returned his gaze with the same calm sincerity. You deserve it. The room fell quiet again for several seconds, the city outside continuing its endless movement, while two people who had entered a carefully structured partnership now found themselves confronting the deeper implications of each other's past. Finally, Nathaniel walked toward a sleek console table near the wall where a tablet displayed security notifications from the building's management system. After glancing at the screen briefly, he turned back toward Amara. Tomorrow morning, I will meet with my executive team to begin the formal integration discussions with Holloway Global. Several infrastructure projects are scheduled for review over the next few months. If any unusual patterns exist in those contracts, my company will want to know about them before moving forward. Amara nodded slightly. Transparency protects everyone involved. Nathaniel allowed a faint smile to appear, subtle but thoughtful. That is a statement most corporate lawyers would support. Amara returned the faint smile, understanding the quiet humor in his response. The conversation might have continued further, but at that moment Nathaniel's phone vibrated again on the marble counter, the soft sound cutting gently through the stillness of the room. He glanced at the screen and saw another message from Marcus Hale. This time the message was slightly longer. Additional records located. One of the companies connected to the original investigation is now bidding on a major infrastructure modernization project in New Jersey. Their proposal includes a subcontracting partnership with a consulting firm that has recently begun collaborating with Holloway Global. Nathaniel read the message twice before slowly lowering the phone, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Amara watched him quietly. Something new has appeared, she said calmly. Nathaniel nodded. It seems your instincts about those patterns may already be relevant. He turned the phone so she could read the message herself. Amara examined the text carefully, her eyes moving across the screen before she looked back up at him. That consulting firm was mentioned during the original investigation, she said quietly. Nathaniel walked toward the window again, looking out across the river where the distant lights of the city continued flickering against the dark surface of the water. For years he had built his company by focusing on technological innovation rather than financial manipulation, believing that Carter Dynamics could succeed by improving efficiency within infrastructure systems rather than exploiting them. Now the possibility that hidden patterns from a previous scandal might intersect with the new alliance he had just formed forced him to reconsider the broader landscape of the industry. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the calm determination that had guided his career. If those patterns still exist, they will not remain hidden for long. Amara stood quietly beside him, the reflection of the skyline shining softly in the glass before them, and although neither of them said it aloud, both understood that the partnership formed tonight had already begun to lead them toward a truth that might reach far beyond the carefully planned corporate marriage the world believed it had witnessed only a few hours earlier. The quiet glow of the city continued to reflect across the tall glass walls of the penthouse, while the message from Marcus Hale lingered in Nathaniel Carter's mind like the opening move of a much larger problem. And for several moments he remained standing near the window overlooking the East River, his eyes following the slow movement of lights crossing the water as ferries traveled between Manhattan and Brooklyn. Behind him, the vast living space of the penthouse remained calm and silent, the polished floors reflecting the skyline like a mirror, while Amara Brooks stood a few steps away studying the same message that had appeared on Nathaniel's phone only minutes earlier. She had already read it twice, her expression thoughtful but composed, as if the information confirmed something she had quietly suspected for some time. Nathaniel finally spoke, his voice steady but focused. The consulting firm mentioned here is called Stonebridge Advisory. Marcus believes they have recently formed a partnership with Holloway Global. Amara nodded slowly. Stonebridge Advisory appeared several times in the financial records during the original investigation. At that time, they operated as an intermediary that helped coordinate contract structures between infrastructure companies and private investors. Nathaniel turned toward her with quiet interest. In other words, they helped move funding through complex channels. Yes, Amara replied calmly. Their role was technically legal, but the way certain contracts were designed allowed project budgets to shift without clear explanation. Nathaniel understood the significance immediately. If Stonebridge Advisory had reappeared in a new infrastructure proposal connected to the alliance between Carter Dynamics and Holloway Global, the situation could quickly become complicated. He crossed the room and placed the phone on the marble counter before speaking again. Marcus mentioned that the project in question involves infrastructure modernization in New Jersey. That type of project typically includes upgrades to transportation corridors, rail connections, and port logistics systems. Amara listened carefully. That is the kind of project where funding structures can become very complex. Nathaniel nodded slightly. Carter Dynamics has not yet committed to that project. The proposal is still under review. Amara looked toward the window again, where the distant skyline shimmered against the dark sky. That means there is still time to understand exactly who is involved. Nathaniel studied her for a moment. You believe Stonebridge Advisory might still be operating in the same way they did during the investigation? Amara did not rush to answer. Instead, she folded her hands gently in front of her and spoke with the same quiet honesty she had carried since the evening began. I believe patterns are easier to repeat than to eliminate. When systems allow complicated financial structures, some people eventually learn how to use those structures in ways that benefit themselves. Nathaniel considered that carefully. He had built Carter Dynamics with a philosophy centered on technological efficiency rather than financial maneuvering, but he knew the infrastructure industry remained filled with layered partnerships and funding agreements that sometimes obscured the full picture of how projects were organized. If Stonebridge Advisory had returned to the center of a new proposal, it was possible that the same networks involved years earlier were beginning to reappear. He walked toward a large digital display built into the wall of the penthouse office area and activated the screen with a brief touch. The system immediately displayed a secure interface connected to Carter Dynamics corporate databases. Nathaniel navigated through several project files until he located the proposal Marcus had referenced, subcontractors and financial contributors connected to the project. The structure was complicated but not unusual for infrastructure development involving multiple states and private investors. Still, the presence of Stonebridge Advisory created an element that neither of them could ignore. After a moment, Nathaniel deactivated the screen and turned back toward Amara. Tomorrow morning, I will ask Marcus to conduct a full review of every company connected to that proposal. If any irregularities exist, we will identify them before Carter Dynamics moves forward. Amara gave a quiet nod of agreement. That would be wise. Nathaniel studied her again. You expected something like this might appear eventually. Amara answered calmly. I hoped it would not. But experience has taught me that systems built on complex contracts often repeat familiar patterns when the right people remain involved. Nathaniel walked slowly back toward the window and looked out across the river again. The skyline of Manhattan glowed quietly beneath the night sky, the endless movement of the city continuing regardless of the private conversations taking place high above the streets. For a moment he allowed himself to consider the strange path that had led to this moment. Only hours earlier the world had watched him marry a woman most people believed to be simply a representative of a corporate alliance. Now he stood beside someone whose past investigation might already be intersecting with the future projects of his company. After a few seconds he spoke again with calm determination. If Stonebridge Advisory intends to operate the same way they did before, they chose the wrong project to hide inside. Amara glanced toward him with quiet curiosity. Because Carter Dynamics values transparency. Nathaniel allowed a faint smile to appear. Because I do not like surprises in my industry. Amara returned the faint smile, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words. Outside the windows the city lights continued reflecting across the river while the distant bridges connected boroughs in long glowing lines. The night remained peaceful from this height. But both of them understood that the information Marcus had uncovered might soon lead them into a far more complicated landscape than the carefully arranged partnership the world believed had just begun. And as the quiet of the penthouse settled around them once more, the alliance between Nathaniel Carter and Amara Brooks began to transform from a strategic corporate marriage into something far more consequential, a partnership. That might soon reveal whether the powerful networks behind America's infrastructure industry had truly changed or simply learned how to hide more carefully within the systems they helped build. The night deepened beyond the tall glass walls of the penthouse while the city of New York continued its endless rhythm far below. And although the streets still carried the distant movement of traffic and light, the quiet interior of Nathaniel Carter's residence felt almost suspended in time, as both he and Amara Brooks considered the implications of the information that had just surfaced. The digital display on the wall had gone dark again after Nathaniel closed the project files. Yet the structure of the proposal remained vivid in his mind, the layers of contractors, consultants, and investors forming a network far more complex than most public announcements ever revealed. Nathaniel walked slowly across the wide living area and stopped near the long table that overlooked the river, resting his hands lightly against the polished surface while thinking through the possibilities that now stood before him. For most of his career, he had approached the infrastructure industry through technological innovation, focusing on systems that made transportation networks more efficient and reliable. Yet the deeper financial architecture behind those networks had always remained a separate world managed by investors, consultants, and legal teams who specialized in the movement of large capital flows. Now that world seemed to be quietly stepping into his own company's path. Amara remained near the windows where the skyline shimmered across the glass like distant stars, and after several moments she spoke again, with the same calm tone that had guided every conversation since the evening began. When organizations such as Stonebridge Advisory reappear in projects like this, it usually means the same financial architecture is being rebuilt under a different name. Nathaniel looked toward her thoughtfully. Meaning the system adapts rather than disappears. Amara nodded slowly. Exactly. Investigations can expose behavior, but they do not always change the incentives that created it. If those incentives remain, the same structures often return in new forms. Nathaniel considered her words carefully. The proposal Marcus had mentioned involved billions of dollars in long-term infrastructure development, including transportation corridors that connected ports, rail distribution hubs, and highway logistics centers across several states. A project of that scale would inevitably attract investors seeking significant returns, and whenever large amounts of capital entered a system, complex financial engineering often followed. He walked back toward the digital display and activated the screen again, pulling up the same project documents they had examined earlier. This time he navigated deeper into the financial structure of the proposal, revealing charts that illustrated how various investment groups planned to contribute funding to different phases of the modernization project. Record on Stonebridge Advisory and the investment funds connected to that proposal. If they are rebuilding the same structure as before, the documentation will eventually reveal it. Amara listened carefully, and when it does, Nathaniel turned slightly toward her. Then Carter Dynamics will decide whether we participate in the project at all. Amara's expression remained thoughtful. Walking away from a project of that scale would attract attention. Nathaniel nodded. Sometimes attention is necessary. Amara looked out across the skyline again, the reflection of the city lights soft against the glass. 6 years ago, the investigation succeeded because several people decided the truth mattered more than the comfort of silence. Nathaniel studied her profile for a moment before answering quietly. I built my company on the belief that infrastructure should improve communities rather than quietly drain their resources. If this project contradicts that principle, Carter Dynamics will not be part of it. Amara met his gaze again, recognizing the sincerity behind his words. For the first time since arriving in the penthouse, a faint warmth entered her expression, a subtle sign of respect forming between two people who had entered a partnership through negotiation but were now discovering shared convictions beneath the structure of that agreement. Outside the windows, the skyline continued glowing against the dark sky, while distant traffic moved across the bridges like thin rivers of light. Nathaniel glanced at the time displayed on the wall panel and realized that only a few hours had passed since the ceremony at the Astoria Regent Ballroom. Yet the world already seemed very different from the carefully controlled celebration that had taken place earlier that evening. When he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet certainty. The alliance the world saw tonight may have been arranged for business reasons, but it seems our partnership will require something more than corporate strategy. Amara understood immediately. It will require honesty about how these systems truly work. Nathaniel gave a small nod, and the willingness to challenge them when necessary. The two of them stood quietly beside the window for several moments longer while the city moved endlessly beyond the glass. And although the world outside believed a strategic marriage had simply strengthened two powerful companies, the reality unfolding inside the penthouse had already begun transforming that alliance into a shared effort to uncover whether the invisible networks shaping America's infrastructure had truly changed or were quietly returning beneath new names and new contracts. Morning arrived slowly over Manhattan, the pale light of early sunrise spreading across the East River like a thin sheet of silver, while the skyline began to wake beneath the quiet glow of office towers and apartment windows switching on one by one across the city. Inside the penthouse of Nathaniel Carter, the atmosphere remained calm and deliberate, the quiet of the previous night giving way to the measured rhythm of a new day that already carried the weight of decisions waiting to be made. Nathaniel stood near the wide kitchen counter dressed in a dark suit prepared for the first executive meeting of the morning, reviewing a tablet that displayed overnight updates from Carter Dynamics headquarters, while the city outside continued shifting from darkness into the soft light of dawn. The events of the wedding ceremony only hours earlier had already begun circulating across national business channels, and several financial news networks were replaying footage of the celebration at the Astoria Regent Ballroom, while analysts discussed the strategic significance of the alliance between Carter Dynamics and Holloway Global Shipping. Yet Nathaniel's attention was focused on a very different subject this morning. The message Marcus Hale had sent during the night had triggered a full internal review of the infrastructure modernization project proposed in New Jersey, and new data had already begun appearing in the company's secure system. Amara Brooks entered the open living area quietly, dressed in simple but elegant professional clothing that reflected the same composed confidence she had carried since the evening before. She paused briefly near the windows where the first sunlight was touching the surface of the river below, then turned toward Nathaniel as he finished reading the latest report on his tablet. Marcus has been working through the night, Nathaniel said calmly as he set the device down on the counter. His team has already identified several additional connections between Stonebridge Advisory and the investment groups listed in the proposal. Amara approached the counter and glanced toward the screen. The pattern is becoming clearer, she said thoughtfully. Nathaniel nodded slightly. Several of the investment funds involved in the project share the same legal representation, and that firm also handled settlements for two of the corporations connected to the investigation 6 years ago. Amara absorbed that information carefully, which means the same legal networks remain active within the system. Nathaniel looked toward the skyline again before speaking. It appears that way. He tapped the tablet once more and brought up a new chart showing the flow of financial commitments across multiple phases of the New Jersey project. Amara studied the display closely for several seconds before pointing toward a line of data linking the advisory structure with one of the infrastructure investment funds. That group did not exist during the original investigation, she said quietly. Nathaniel agreed. It was created only 18 months ago. Amara considered the structure thoughtfully. New organizations often appear when older systems attempt to reorganize themselves. Nathaniel leaned slightly against the counter while reflecting on the implications. The proposal itself appears legitimate on the surface. All documentation meets regulatory standards. The financial commitments are supported by large institutional investors. Amara looked up from the screen. That is usually how complex financial systems operate. Everything appears legitimate when viewed individually. The challenge is understanding how all the pieces connect together. Nathaniel allowed a faint smile of appreciation. That sounds like the beginning of another investigation. Amara returned the quiet smile. Sometimes the truth hides inside ordinary paperwork. Nathaniel deactivated the tablet display and placed the device back on the counter. In less than 30 minutes, he would be seated in a conference room with his senior leadership team discussing the integration strategy with Holloway Global. The project in New Jersey would almost certainly appear on the agenda, and until yesterday, he would have approached that discussion with the same strategic focus he applied to every new opportunity. Now the situation carried additional complexity. Amara watched him thoughtfully. You will have to decide how much of this information to share with your executives. Nathaniel considered that question carefully. Marcus already understands the potential concern. The rest of the team will need to see enough evidence to justify deeper review without creating unnecessary speculation. Amara nodded slowly. Transparency requires balance. Nathaniel looked at her with quiet curiosity. You have experience navigating situations like this. Amara responded calmly. Investigations succeed when people remain careful about how information is introduced. If concerns appear too early without supporting documentation, those responsible for the system often close ranks and protect themselves. Nathaniel recognized the strategic logic in her explanation. Then the first step will be to gather as much data as possible before raising broader questions. Exactly, Amara said. Outside the windows the city had fully awakened now. Morning traffic beginning to fill the streets, while sunlight reflected brightly across the water and the distant towers of Midtown. The calm beauty of the view contrasted sharply with the intricate financial networks they had begun examining inside the penthouse. Nathaniel checked the time again and reached for his jacket. I will ask Marcus to continue expanding the review while the executive team evaluates the project proposal. If additional connections appear, we will examine them carefully before any decisions are made. Amara listened quietly. And if the pattern confirms what we suspect? Nathaniel met her gaze with calm certainty. Then Carter Dynamics will choose a different path forward. Amara understood the significance of that statement immediately. Rejecting a project of that magnitude could shift billions of dollars in infrastructure investment and attract attention from across the industry. Yet the quiet conviction in Nathaniel's voice suggested he had already begun considering that possibility. For several seconds neither of them spoke while the sunlight brightened the wide living area around them. Finally Nathaniel moved toward the elevator that led directly to the private parking level below the building. The boardroom meeting will begin in less than an hour, he said. Marcus will join me there with the preliminary findings. Amara walked with him toward the elevator entrance, the soft sound of their footsteps echoing gently across the polished floor. When the elevator doors opened, Nathaniel paused for a moment before stepping inside and looked back at her thoughtfully. Last night the world believed this alliance was designed only to strengthen two companies. Amara held his gaze calmly. The world often sees only the surface of important decisions. Nathaniel nodded slightly. It seems our partnership may require something more than business strategy. Amara responded quietly. It may require courage from both of us. Nathaniel stepped into the elevator, and the doors closed slowly while the car began descending toward the street level below. As the penthouse grew quiet again, Amara walked back toward the windows overlooking the river where the morning sunlight now shimmered across the water like a field of bright reflections. And although the city outside continued its usual routine of business and movement, The quiet alliance formed between Nathaniel Carter and Amara Brooks had already begun moving toward a deeper truth that might soon reshape far more than a single infrastructure project. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Carter Dynamics headquarters overlooked the bright skyline of Midtown Manhattan, where morning sunlight reflected across rows of glass towers, and the streets below carried the fast rhythm of a city already deep into its workday. Yet inside the polished executive suite, the atmosphere felt calm and precise as Nathaniel Carter entered the room with the quiet authority that had defined his leadership since the early days of the company. The long walnut table was already occupied by several senior executives, each seated with tablets and printed reports prepared for the strategic integration meeting with Holloway Global Shipping. And near the center of the table, Marcus Hale sat reviewing a series of financial diagrams displayed on a digital screen built into the wall. When Nathaniel stepped into the room, the quiet conversations paused immediately, and Marcus looked up with a small nod of acknowledgement that carried the subtle signal that important information was ready to be discussed. Nathaniel took his seat at the head of the table while the executives settled into attentive silence, and after a brief moment, he began the meeting with the same calm clarity he used in every major decision. Thank you for assembling on short notice this morning. As everyone here already knows, the alliance with Holloway Global represents a significant expansion of Carter Dynamics' technological infrastructure systems into several new transportation corridors. However, before we move forward with certain proposals, I have asked Marcus to review the financial architecture of one particular modernization project currently under consideration. Marcus activated the digital display behind him, and the screen illuminated with a network diagram showing the proposed New Jersey infrastructure initiative that had appeared in the overnight report. Lines connected construction contractors, advisory firms, and investment funds in a complex structure that resembled a web of financial relationships extending across several organizations. Marcus spoke with his usual measured tone. During the initial proposal review, we identified Stonebridge Advisory as one of the financial coordination partners involved in structuring investment commitments for the project. While that role is technically within regulatory guidelines, further examination revealed that Stonebridge Advisory has maintained historical ties with several entities associated with a previous infrastructure investigation that occurred 6 years ago. A quiet shift of attention moved around the table as the executives studied the diagram more closely. One of the senior financial analysts leaned forward slightly. Are you suggesting this proposal might involve the same financial structure that triggered that investigation? Marcus answered carefully. At this stage, we are not making definitive conclusions. However, the advisory relationships and investment channels appear to follow a similar pattern to the systems that were previously examined by federal regulators. Nathaniel listened without interruption, allowing the room to absorb the implications before speaking again. Carter Dynamics was built on the principle that infrastructure technology should strengthen communities and improve efficiency across transportation networks. If any project we participate in carries financial structures that contradict that principle, we need to understand those structures before moving forward. One of the engineering directors raised a thoughtful question. The modernization project itself appears technically sound. Our systems could improve freight distribution along the entire corridor. Nathaniel nodded. The engineering opportunity is significant. But technology cannot operate independently from the financial framework surrounding a project. If the investment architecture raises concerns, the long-term consequences could affect both the communities involved and the reputation of Carter Dynamics. Marcus adjusted the display again, revealing a list of investment groups connected through Stonebridge Advisory. Several of these funds were created within the last 2 years, he explained. While new investment groups are common in infrastructure development, the legal representation for these funds connects to firms that previously managed settlements related to the earlier investigation. Another executive spoke with measured curiosity. Are these connections strong enough to justify delaying our participation? Nathaniel responded calmly. That is exactly what we intend to determine. Marcus has begun a deeper analysis of every entity involved in the advisory structure. Until we understand the full architecture of this proposal, Carter Dynamics will not commit to any phase of the project. The room fell briefly silent as the executives considered the direction Nathaniel had just outlined. Most of them understood that stepping back from a multi-billion-dollar modernization initiative would attract attention across the industry. Yet they also knew that Carter Dynamics had built its reputation on careful decision-making rather than short-term opportunity. Marcus closed the display after summarizing the initial findings and looked toward Nathaniel. We expect additional documentation from the investment partners later this afternoon. That should clarify whether these relationships are merely coincidental or structurally significant. Nathaniel nodded slightly. Continue the review and keep the analysis focused on documented evidence. We will make our decision based on facts rather than speculation. The meeting moved forward to other agenda items after that, but the atmosphere in the room had subtly shifted. The alliance with Holloway Global remained strategically valuable, yet the possibility that hidden financial patterns might be emerging inside the first major project connected to the partnership created a new layer of responsibility for everyone at the table. Nearly an hour later, the meeting concluded and the executives dispersed into the busy corridors of Carter Dynamics headquarters, leaving Nathaniel and Marcus alone in the quiet conference room overlooking the city. Marcus closed his tablet and looked toward Nathaniel thoughtfully. I assume Amara Brooks already recognized these patterns before the proposal reached our desk. Nathaniel walked slowly toward the window where the skyline stretched across the horizon in bright daylight. She suspected the structure might appear eventually. Marcus nodded with quiet respect. That explains why she agreed to the alliance. Nathaniel considered that possibility for a moment. Perhaps. Marcus studied the city outside the window before speaking again. If the system she uncovered years ago is rebuilding itself through new investment channels, exposing it again could affect some powerful interests. Nathaniel remained calm as he answered. Then it is even more important that we understand exactly how it works. Marcus gave a small nod of agreement. I will continue tracing the investment pathways. If the pattern is real, the documentation will reveal it. Nathaniel turned back toward the conference table and gathered the remaining reports while the city outside continued its steady movement beneath the sunlight. Only yesterday, the alliance between Carter Dynamics and Holloway Global had appeared to the world as a calculated business expansion celebrated with cameras and champagne. Now the same alliance had quietly opened the door to a deeper investigation that could determine whether the infrastructure systems shaping the country's future were built on transparent foundations or on financial networks that had simply learned how to hide more carefully within the language of modern investment partnerships. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the glass walls of Carter Dynamics headquarters while the city outside continued moving with its relentless energy. Taxis weaving through avenues and pedestrians flowing along sidewalks far below the tower where Nathaniel Carter's office overlooked the skyline like a quiet command center above the noise of Manhattan. Inside the executive floor, the atmosphere had shifted subtly since the morning meeting, because the preliminary analysis Marcus Hale had begun was now revealing more details about the financial architecture surrounding the New Jersey modernization proposal. Nathaniel stood near the wide window of his office with a tablet in his hand, reading through the newest files Marcus had forwarded during the past hour. The reports confirmed what both he and Amara Brooks had quietly suspected the night before. Stonebridge Advisory was not simply acting as a neutral consulting partner. The firm sat at the center of a carefully layered structure connecting multiple investment funds, construction contractors, and advisory partners whose legal representation traced back to several companies involved in the earlier infrastructure investigation 6 years ago. None of the connections were technically illegal on their own, yet together they formed a financial network that looked increasingly familiar. Nathaniel set the tablet down slowly on his desk and exhaled in thoughtful silence while sunlight reflected across the polished surface of the room. A gentle knock sounded at the office door before Marcus Hale stepped inside carrying a slim folder filled with additional documentation. Marcus closed the door behind him and walked toward the desk with the calm professionalism that had defined his role at Carter Dynamics since the company's earliest expansion years. I have reviewed the next layer of financial filings connected to the New Jersey project, Marcus said as he placed the folder on the desk. The advisory partnerships form a circular structure of investment commitments that move through 3 intermediary firms before reaching the primary contractors. Nathaniel opened the folder and scanned the diagrams carefully. That arrangement would make it extremely difficult for regulators to track how certain project funds are distributed. Marcus nodded. Exactly. Each step in the process appears compliant with financial regulations, but when the entire structure is examined together, the same pattern from the earlier investigation begins to reappear. Nathaniel leaned back slightly in his chair while absorbing the significance of the discovery. If the pattern is confirmed, Stonebridge Advisory is effectively rebuilding the same system using new investment groups as the outer layer. Marcus gave a quiet nod, which means the system never disappeared. It simply reorganized itself. Nathaniel remained silent for several seconds before speaking again. How certain are we about these connections? Marcus answered carefully. The documentation is strong enough to justify serious concern, but we still need confirmation from the final investment. Disclosure scheduled for release tomorrow morning. Nathaniel closed the folder slowly and looked toward the skyline beyond the window. The city outside continued moving with the same confident rhythm it had always carried. Yet inside his office, the alliance formed only the night before had already begun evolving into something far more complicated than a corporate strategy. At that moment, Nathaniel's phone vibrated softly on the desk, and when he glanced at the screen, he saw Amara Brooks's name appear in a message notification. The message was brief. I believe I have identified the final connection that explains why this project returned now. Nathaniel immediately opened the message while Marcus waited quietly across the desk. Amara had attached a document from the Brooks Justice Foundation research database, a record showing that one of the newly created infrastructure investment funds connected to the project had been established by a private equity group whose leadership included a former executive from one of the corporations that had quietly settled during the earlier investigation. Nathaniel studied the file carefully before looking up at Marcus. It appears the original network never disappeared. One of the executives involved simply waited several years and rebuilt the structure through new investment partners. Marcus examined the file on the tablet and nodded slowly. That explains why the advisory network looks so familiar. The same leadership is operating behind a different set of corporate names. Nathaniel stood and walked toward the window again, the sunlight now beginning to fade into the softer tones of late afternoon as shadows stretched across the city. For years he had believed the infrastructure industry was gradually evolving toward more transparent systems, especially as technology companies like Carter Dynamics introduced new tools that improved efficiency and accountability within transportation networks. Now it appeared that certain financial actors had simply adapted their strategies to remain hidden within the complexity of modern investment partnerships. Marcus spoke again after a moment. If Carter Dynamics publicly withdraws from the New Jersey project, the advisory network may continue operating with other partners. Nathaniel turned back toward him. Then we will need to do more than simply withdraw. Marcus watched him thoughtfully. What do you propose? Nathaniel picked up the folder again and closed it with quiet precision. Tomorrow morning, the investment disclosures will finalize the structure of this proposal. Once those records are public, we will have enough evidence to raise formal questions about how the project has been organized. Marcus understood immediately. You intend to bring the structure into the open. Nathaniel nodded calmly. If the same system that diverted infrastructure resources years ago is rebuilding itself, the industry deserves to know about it before billions of dollars are committed again. Marcus gave a small nod of respect. That approach will certainly attract attention. Nathaniel allowed a faint smile. Transparency usually does. Across the city, the sunlight began fading behind the tall towers of Midtown, while evening approached slowly over the skyline. And in that quiet office high above the streets, the partnership between Nathaniel Carter and Amara Brooks had now uncovered the final connection linking a modern infrastructure proposal to a financial system that had once been exposed but never completely erased. The world still believed their alliance had been formed to strengthen two powerful companies. In reality, it had already become something far more consequential. A collaboration that might soon determine whether the hidden networks shaping the nation's infrastructure would finally face the light of public scrutiny or continue operating quietly behind the language of modern investment strategy. The next morning, the skyline of Manhattan appeared brighter than usual beneath a clear blue sky, and inside the main auditorium of Carter Dynamics headquarters, a large presentation screen illuminated the room with a soft glow, while dozens of industry representatives, analysts, and infrastructure partners gathered for the scheduled announcement regarding the New Jersey Modernization Initiative. What had originally been planned as a routine confirmation of Carter Dynamics' participation in the multi-billion-dollar project had quietly transformed into something far more significant, and the quiet tension moving through the room reflected that change even before the event officially began. Nathaniel Carter stood near the side of the stage reviewing a final set of documents with Marcus Hale, while several journalists positioned their cameras along the back wall. Across the room, representatives from Holloway Global Shipping spoke quietly with investment partners connected to the project, their conversations carrying the polished confidence typical of large infrastructure announcements where billions of dollars and years of development were expected to follow. Yet Nathaniel remained calm and composed as always, his posture relaxed but focused while he examined the finalized disclosure files that had been released earlier that morning. The documents confirmed what he and Amara Brooks had uncovered during the previous 24 hours. The advisory structure surrounding the project connected directly to the same executive network responsible for rebuilding the financial system exposed years earlier. The names were different, the investment funds were newly formed, and the contracts were written with greater legal precision. Yet the architecture beneath the paperwork revealed the same circular pathways that redirected funding through multiple intermediaries before reaching the construction firms responsible for delivering the actual infrastructure improvements. Marcus closed the folder quietly and spoke in a low voice. The disclosure filings leave very little ambiguity. The advisory network is exactly what we suspected. Nathaniel nodded once while looking toward the audience gathering in the auditorium. Then the next step becomes very clear. A few minutes later, the event moderator stepped onto the stage and welcomed the audience, briefly describing the significance of the modernization proposal for improving freight movement along the Northeastern Transportation Corridor. Cameras began recording as Nathaniel Carter was invited to the podium, and when he stepped forward, the room grew quiet with the attentive anticipation that always accompanied major announcements in the infrastructure industry. Nathaniel placed his notes on the podium, but did not immediately look down at them. Instead, he allowed a moment of silence to settle across the auditorium before speaking with the calm clarity that had built his reputation across boardrooms and financial conferences throughout the country. Infrastructure projects shape the daily lives of millions of people, he began. They determine how goods move across our economy, how communities connect to opportunity, and how public investment supports long-term growth. That responsibility requires more than technological innovation. It requires transparency in how those projects are structured and financed. The audience listened carefully while cameras captured every word. Nathaniel continued in the same steady tone. Carter Dynamics was invited to participate in the modernization initiative announced today because our technology improves efficiency within transportation networks. However, during our review of the project structure, we identified a financial advisory framework that raises serious concerns regarding the transparency of the investment architecture supporting this proposal. A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the room as journalists leaned forward to record his words more closely. Nathaniel raised one hand slightly toward the large display screen behind him, where Marcus activated the presentation, revealing the network diagrams that had been analyzed over the past day. The screen displayed the complex chain of investment funds and advisory firms connected through Stonebridge Advisory, clearly illustrating how financial commitments circulated through intermediary entities before reaching the project contractors. These structures are technically compliant when viewed individually, Nathaniel explained calmly. But when examined together, they recreate a financial system that previously diverted infrastructure funding away from the communities those projects were designed to support. The audience remained silent as the implications became clear. Representatives from several investment groups exchanged uneasy glances while reporters typed quickly on their devices. Nathaniel continued without raising his voice. Because Carter Dynamics believes infrastructure must serve the public interest with full transparency, we have decided not to participate in this project under its current financial structure. Instead, we are formally requesting a regulatory review of the advisory network involved in this proposal so that all stakeholders can understand how these investment pathways operate before any further commitments are made. The room remained still for several seconds before the moderator stepped forward again to conclude the announcement, but the atmosphere had already shifted dramatically. What had begun as a routine industry event had become the opening moment of a new investigation that would soon reach far beyond the walls of the auditorium. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel returned to his penthouse overlooking the East River, where the late sunlight once again reflected across the water in long, shimmering patterns. Amara stood near the window watching the skyline, while news channels replayed the announcement across the television mounted quietly along the wall. Nathaniel walked into the room and placed his jacket on a chair before joining her near the glass. "The response from the industry will be significant," he said calmly. Amara nodded thoughtfully while the distant city stretched beyond the river. When systems built on secrecy are exposed, the response is always significant. Nathaniel looked out across the skyline where the bridges connected the boroughs in long arcs of steel and light. "Last night the world believed this alliance existed to strengthen two corporations," he said quietly. Amara turned toward him with a calm expression that carried both understanding and quiet respect. "Sometimes alliances become more meaningful than the reason they were created." Nathaniel allowed a small, thoughtful smile, while the evening light faded slowly across the city. "Then it seems our partnership has already achieved something neither of us expected when this arrangement began." Amara looked back toward the river where the lights of Manhattan were beginning to glow again as night approached. "The truth has a way of changing the purpose of every agreement," she said softly. And as the city outside continued its endless motion, the alliance formed between Nathaniel Carter and Amara had quietly transformed from a strategic corporate marriage into a shared commitment to ensure that the systems shaping the nation's infrastructure would no longer remain hidden behind the language of complicated financial partnerships, but instead stand openly in the light, where every community, depending on them, could finally see how those systems truly worked.